Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Dino Bidala, and look who's back, folks. It's Ali Velshi. He's got a brand new book, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy, Small Acts of Courage, is the title. You know him from his own show on MSNBC, Velshi, Saturday and Sunday mornings, award-winning journalist and a friend of mine. Ali, welcome back to Salon Talks.
Nice to be back with you, my friend.
Nice to see you. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
You were always coming out with new books. Last time we had you on, the indictment books. Now we're here. You know, your book resonates with me because I'm the child of an immigrant. You're an immigrant yourself, but so much of your story in your book is about your family, why they came, what they hoped, what their dreams were. And you start out in the first chapter with the idea of why does anyone leave anywhere? And I think that's so important because there's so many Americans, especially on the right, who are like, these people are coming here to take our jobs, to destroy our country. Why do people, why did your family leave India generations ago?
So you locked into, there are a lot of things in this book and different people read it differently, but you locked into the main theme here, and that it is a universal story of migration. Right? Everybody leaves everywhere historically. That's how it's generally gone. And that's not just okay, it's the way of the world. In our moment right now, economically, it's an imperative, right, in America. We're on the wrong side of this whole thing because we have a negative birth rate in America and we need immigrants, and yet we're developing into this anti-immigrant society. Now, I'm telling that story from the other side. My family have been migrants since the late 1800s. Right? They left Africa, they left India because of drought. They went to South Africa, which was in theory the promised land, except it was this deeply racist society. And they wanted to change it for the better. So imagine that. They go to a country that's not their country, and then they're telling that country and the government of that country in the process of fighting against racism that you're not doing this right and you're not treating us properly and you can do better. And these other people in South Africa are saying, why don't y'all go home if you don't like it here? Does that sound familiar to you?
Sure.
That people come to this country and they would like us to do better for them and for ourselves, and our attitude is, you're not from here, you're just taking our jobs and you're doing bad things. So my family gets to South Africa, they become anti-apartheid fighters, which makes them the enemy of the government. Then they leave to go to Kenya, where I was born, thinking, this is a real democracy. They got to Kenya when it was a colony. They got to see the British flag come down, the Kenyan flag go up. Can you imagine being there at the birth of democracy, being able to vote for the first time because they were not able to do that because of the color of their skin? But that dream didn't work out for other reasons, and that was that there was sort of an anti-immigrant, anti-Asian sentiment going through to East Africa at the time. You'll remember in Uganda, they expelled all the Asians. So finally, my parents get to North America, and it is the promised land, right? It's freedom, and they jump in with both feet. And basically, this is the story of how my family has just fought to be involved in the political and the civil process for so long. And that's the moment we're all still in right now, right? You and I are having discussions of the sort that my grandfather and my great-grandfather would have liked to have had, but in apartheid South Africa, that would have been illegal.
And you know, you touched on your family, Indian heritage, Kenya as well. They have in common, they were part of Great Britain. They were part of the British Empire. And they were colonies. And you know, my dad was born in what was then Palestine, but it was a British mandate. So it was also, in a way, colonized in a different way. How does that experience affect your family and you, that growing up in what was a colony? Then you went to Canada, which is different, but still part of the British Empire.
Part of the British Empire and part of the Commonwealth. A former colony that didn't throw off the yokes of colonialism. So you don't have this anti-colonial sentiment in Canada. In fact, the king is still on the money. I grew up, you know, thinking the queen was a really nice lady, and she was. But liking the royal family because you think they're nice and sweet does not take away the fact that the British Empire and colonialism was shit for everybody involved except the colonials, except the British. There is no country into which they went that they didn't wreck. Right? They thought that, oh, they'll give you an education. 2% of your people can go to London and get a law degree, as Gandhi did, by the way. He was a British educated lawyer, but he was an Indian. They will say, well, we brought you railroads and we taught you heathens the English language and we brought you Christianity. It's all garbage. When the British took over India, India was a quarter of the world's GDP, a quarter of the world's economic production. When they left India in 1948, 2%. They fully wrecked the country. And today, it's not even 10%. It's the world's most populous democracy. populous country, and it's not even 10%. India will get there eventually, but it'll take them decades to get back to where they were. So colonialism actually wrecked the world. That said, it was better than apartheid where my parents were. And so it all became measures of betterness. And by the time they got to Canada, what they found was not just freedom, not just equality, but the ability to be involved in the political process. Now, here's the rub. I figured when my parents got to Canada in 1970, 71, that fight was over. I didn't grow up thinking about the fight for democracy. And now look where we are. Now look where we are, where you and I talk on a regular basis about the possible demise of democracy in our country in 2024. And that's a real discussion, one that I didn't think I would have to. I thought that was a conversation for my grandfather and my parents and all of them, not for me.
There are so many examples of there are women who didn't think Roe v. Wade was ever going to be an issue again. And the Voting Rights Act,
recently.
Right, the Voting Rights Act passed in 1968. If you're black in America, you had more voting protections in August 1965 when the law was signed than you do today, because they gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So it is the move backwards is happening. But there was something, though, I want to go back to your book, something very interesting. You mentioned in Canada, that's when you became Indian. And explain why that is, because that might not make sense to people.
Yeah, because when you grow up in this sort of diasporic way, you're never clear what you are in your new country, right? You've had this experience your own self, right? You've grown up and at different points in your life, your identities have been different depending on what's under threat or what's in vogue. When my parents were in South Africa, they were Indian because that's how the society divided you up into every ridiculous Byzantine categories. Then they get to Kenya, and they're sort of South African, but they're still in the Indian diaspora in South Africa, in Kenya, and they want to be Kenyan. They want to be part of this new democracy, but that didn't quite work out. Then they get to Canada, and they want to be Canadian, but my grandmother, who raised us and lived with us, wore a sari and spoke Gujarati, and the food inside our house was all Indian. The decorations were all Kenyan because we were so far removed from India that we didn't have any Indian stuff. And in South Africa, you couldn't take on or enjoy the parts of anybody else's culture because they had apartheid meant white people had their music and their art, black people had their music and their art, colored people, as they called them, who were mixed race between white and black, had their own music and art and way of speaking, and Indians had their own, and Chinese had their own. So there was no carryover from South Africa. So we get to Toronto, and we're not white, because Toronto at the time, when I grew up, was 17 different kinds of white. Right? It was Irish, Irish Protestants, Irish Catholics, Scottish Presbyterians, English Anglicans. And so we were, by definition, had to be something. We were Indian. And my buddy Mikey, who lived on my street, who is 1/4 Sicilian, 1/4 French Canadian, and half Syrian, Arab, he was also not 17 different kinds of white, so the two of us were like brothers. We don't look anything alike, but they treated us like brothers because we were the other on the street. So I grew up sort of identifying a little bit as Indian, but very confused as a kid. Am I Kenyan? Am I Indian? Am I Canadian? Am I South African? What am I?
It's interesting, too, when you feel alone. Like, I grew up in Lodi, New Jersey, where you're either Italian or my father. That was the entire town. Everyone, my dad was the only non-Italian. I'm half Italian because my mom. So we fit in, but it was weird to have that experience. So you're an outsider. Then I really grew up identifying as a white guy. Then 9/11 happens, and I'm told I'm not white. My white card's taken away, and now I'm just an American patriot.
Yeah, but it is great though, right? Because people of our age, when we were kids, you generally, if you were something different from the mainstream, you hid that. And that moved into my career, right? Where I did not want to be the other guy when I worked for local news in Toronto. I was not drawing attention to me, my people's holidays, my people's events and all that. I was just trying to get a seat at the table. And now it's amazing. Kids take the food that they ate for dinner last night to their schools. They have very long ethnic names. They're proud of it. I think it's amazing that there's much more freedom to be your authentic self in America or Canada today than there was when I was growing up.
Yeah, I'm much more in touch with being Arab today than I was growing up. It just wasn't the life that I lived. So things change. It's interesting though, you're of mixed heritage, not mixed, you're Indian ethnically, Muslim religiously. When you see what's going on in India, is it painful? With Modi, there's a Hindu nationalist spewing, peddling anti-Muslim hate?
It devastates me on a million levels, right? One is that my family were Indians. Most Pakistanis were Indians, but there are actually more Muslims in India than there are in the country of Pakistan. There's there's almost 250,000 Muslims in India who are being treated very, very poorly. But here's the sad thing. 1948, Gandhi gives India independence. This is a guy, he said, I was born in India, but I was made in South Africa. So all the stuff in my book about what he does in South Africa, he leaves in 1913 from South Africa believing he has failed. Ultimately, he had set the seeds in motion not only for the end of apartheid, but for the civil rights movement in the United States. But he thinks he's failed. He then goes to India, convinces everybody about this independence thing, negotiates with Britain, gets independence in a pluralistic society. Now, the saddest thing to Gandhi after 1948 was that India and Pakistan became two countries because he wanted it to be one. He really was a pluralist. But the Muslims said, we're going to drown in your massive country, so we want our own country. So there's been this tension. The two countries have officially been at war since the day of independence. But India has tried to be a pluralistic country. It has gone and educated its workforce. It's become a major force in the world. And now it is just becoming a xenophobic, Hindu nationalist, Islamophobic country. But it's not just that. They arrest journalists. They arrest opposition leaders. It is like Hungary and to some degree like Turkey becoming an anti-democratic country. The world's biggest democracy.
Right.
The democracy that it threw off the yoke of colonialism in 1948. This is the country that could be leading the world right now on so many levels, especially when we need leaders who are democratic leaders. And India is going in the wrong direction.
And the United States potentially is going to go in the wrong direction as well. And we have to look to leadership outside of our soil for democratic leaders on the world stage if Donald Trump were to win. And we'll get to that in a little bit. I was curious too, you write in your book about how Canadians viewed the United States of America and how that changed in 2016 when Donald Trump won. Share a little on that, please.
I mean, first of all, I think they didn't. Every time when I worked in Canada in the early days and I'd go back, I worked in the United States and I'd go back to Canada and people say, what do Americans think of us? And I'd say, they don't. The average American knows something about Canada.
Right.
Whether it's Mounties and their hats, or that it's wilderness, or that they went to a camp there, or that the Olympics were in Calgary, or that they were in Montreal, or hockey. But generally speaking, didn't know much about Canada at all. Mm-hmm. And we grew up watching American TV, so it was very hard to distinguish in Canada between Canadians and Americans. But after 9/11, you started to see some distinctions between these two countries because you realized that Canada had achieved pluralism a bit better than America had. And then after the election of Donald Trump, there were a whole lot of Americans looking at real estate in Canada and understanding, Justin Trudeau had just been elected prime minister and this handsome, eloquent guy, and they're doing sort of normal things as a government and being leaders on the world stage, and we had Donald Trump. So I think a lot of people in America became very interested in Canada after 2016, and by the election of 2024, I think they're going to be looking for a lot of real estate in Canada as well.
Depending how this turns out, I've never had more conversation with people who've talked about, in all seriousness, a Plan B country.
100%. Yeah, people Google how it is Americans would go to Canada.
And also exploring, my grandfather's born in another country. My father's
get a
born in
visa,
another country.
I get a European passport or something of that nature?
So, look, some people get the threat. I mean, people were saying that, get the threat.
Yeah.
I fear that too many Americans don't get the threat. Yeah. And I think we've had this discussion before about, your viewers don't always want to see what Trump is saying.
Correct.
And I get my listeners on my show and Salon readers as well. We don't, but I think we must pay attention because, for example, what he's saying now at every rally just about, he's going to use the word liberate. He's going to liberate the United States from a list of enemies. And we're on that list.
Correct.
It's the media. Yep. It's Democrats, sometimes use the term Democrats, other times it's people who are the political class. And his crowd is cheering. If he wins, he'll think he has a mandate to liberate the country from us. And I don't know what that means.
And they've written it down
as
part of this Project 2025, right? It's not this loose clown car of an administration that it was last time. Last time you could laugh at them. You could get away and say, they didn't really break all that much, which I disagree with, because they've broken faith in the political process, which is all that we apparently had. But if it happens this time around, I think there'll be real retribution, first of all. He has used that kind of language that Mussolini has used. And I think there are two kinds of people who are worried. There are the people who are kind of worried, who are looking for an escape hatch. Can I go to Canada? Can I go to Europe? And there are those who are worried, who are saying, what will the fight look like at that point? For instance, there are some people who think it would be better, people who are Democrats who say it would be better if Donald Trump won because it'll hasten the decline and the demise of America, out of which a phoenix shall rise.
Who's saying that?
I've heard it, and I don't know that this. I don't think that makes sense. I don't know that we should burn the place down to try and save it. I think it is a house that is dry, and there's kindling, and there's sparks in the air, and we need to keep the house from burning down. I would rather do that. But some people say it's so broken that let the whole thing crumble. But I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what starting again looks like for America. The American experiment has not been a failure. It has not been perfect at any point. And I think there have been remarkable efforts leading to the Civil War, leading to suffrage, leading to the Civil Rights Movement, to try and improve things in this country. And more often than not, after a period of time, we've done better. That's what we need to continue. The idea is that democracy is a cactus, as I write about in the book. It's relatively hardy, but you can't give it no attention. You can't stick it in a dark closet and hope it'll work, right? You have to give it some attention, and that's where we are. Democracy will go away if you don't practice it and you don't nurture it, and that's the moment we're at in America.
Do you think the fact that our family comes from different countries, and you literally came from a different country, but you grew up in North America, that we understand that you could lose this.
You could
lose
this,
I really get a sense my fellow Americans don't believe it. Whatever the it is can actually happen here. And my job, I feel, is to tell them it could happen here.
Oh, I write about this in the book, so I didn't mean to do this. I probably should have found it if I knew that I was going to read about it. But I wrote about this. For
those at home with the book, open to page 127. It's going to be, I'm not sure.
You know, I wrote about this because, and I won't read the whole package, but it's about when my father actually lost his first election.
Right, he ran for election county and he won, wins the second.
And I'm going to read you the last passage of chapter 6. And I said, thanks to my father, that was the night that I learned that there's a deeper way to think about politics, which for so many people has become a dirty word. Politicians are all crooks, they say. The system is rigged. I don't trust any of them. And it's true that there's no shortage of politicians who provide reasons not to trust politicians. But the world is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. I know that because my immediate family is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. And on that night in 1981, that dingy old storefront campaign office was full of people celebrating simply because they'd exercised their right to engage in politics for the right reasons. To this day, when I hear people run down politics and politicians, I recoil, because cynicism about politics is actually a luxury of those who have never had to experience life without it. And if those people ever truly lost their ability to participate in the system, they'd never take it for granted again. And that's my point, that we can be cynical about politics because we have had it the whole time.
Certainly.
There are people, I just literally got back. I got off a plane last night from the Middle East. There are people all over the Middle East, notwithstanding the current war, who are talking about politics, how they would love to have a real political system with real political parties where they could debate and do those things. We have it, Dean. Yeah. Don't give it up. Don't ignore it. You can't say, I can't read this anymore, I can't watch TV anymore, it's too much for me. It can't be too much for you.
First of all, if I ever have a book, I would beg you to be the audio reader of the audiobook, because your voice is an amazing reading. Look, there is, you know, Jimmy Carter gave a famous speech, the malaise speech.
Yes.
He didn't mention the word malaise in it, but malaise is sort of like this downtrodden sense. Yes. It's like a subtle depression, things aren't going well. I feel that, and I don't know why I feel that now. That's part of the problem in America. And you mentioned the Middle East, though. Last two things I want to touch on Gaza. You've covered it, this conflict, you've covered other conflicts. Why does this one feel so different? Why is this one so heavy for so many of us?
It's truly the worst story in the world. It is the equivalent of being a firefighter, and you get on the radio, you get a call, you get dispatched to a building, and then you show up, and this building's on fire, and it's the biggest building you've ever seen. There's no way that your hoses or the water will reach the top. There's no way your ladders will reach the top. There are people up there who need to get out, and you can't rescue them. But you can't get in your fire truck and leave. You have to stay here until this is fixed, even though it is obvious to everybody around you that it's not going to get fixed. Because in the case of Israel and Gaza, the leadership in both cases are deeply disincentivized to solve this problem, because a real solution to this problem largely means the end of Netanyahu and his crazy right-wing government, and it probably means the end of the people who currently run Hamas. Doesn't mean that the concept that is Hamas, which has been around since the 1920s, will go away, but these leaders will go away. They might get exiled somewhere, but the Israelis will take them out. So everybody who can do something about this is disincentivized to do it. The rest of us in the world have decided to start reading this book from the final chapter, right? This is the demise of social media and cable news. What it has done to us is that it's caused us to have a hot take on a situation that does not deserve a hot take. This is an old problem. It's an old case. It needs to be studied and understood. It is actually solvable. There is a way in which the people of those lands can live in the peace that they deserve and the security that they deserve. It is the will that is absent from a whole lot of leaders in that part of the country who are not prepared to do it. And what we in America owe the world is to know the full story, to be fair arbiters of this thing, to humanize the people on both sides of this issue, and to say this does not need to happen. We can find a way to get them their safety on all sides of that issue, and to one day have them live as neighbors who respect each other.
And
it's doable.
It would take a lot of compassion and empathy.
A lot.
And it would take a balanced U.S. policy to incentivize compromise.
Yes.
We're
not there yet.
Because if you're the Israeli government, you don't actually have to compromise. We're going to end up giving you exactly what you want in the long run.
Yes.
And so that doesn't incentivize the compromise you need to get to a just solution where there's safety and security for both Palestinian and Israelis going forward.
The problem is that there are a lot of people who want that, who are very frustrated with the Biden administration right now. So both in primaries and in the election are suggesting they will vote against Joe Biden, knowing well that that will result in a victory for Donald Trump. And there must be some great satisfaction in saying, because of what you did, I voted against you and I took you down. And I can empathize with people who think that way, except then this is a binary election. Whether Israel-Palestine's your main issue, or climate's your main issue, or whatever your main issue is, it's a binary election. If it's not Joe Biden, it's going to be Donald Trump. And so everybody needs to sit for a moment and be comfortable with the idea that Donald Trump may be the president of the United States for another 4 years, and whatever carries from that.
Way beyond that. If Trump gets in,
could be for
as
40
Robert
years.
De Niro said, he's never leaving.
Yes, right.
He told. Very last thing here, and it would touch on a lot what we talked about, but the title of your book is the fight for democracy and small acts of courage. How has your family's small acts of courage inspired you and this passion you have to fight for our democracy here in the United States of America?
Well, first of all, it's made me realize that the fight doesn't end. Our grandchildren will still be fighting for democracy, as well they should, right? There will always be people who don't want democracy, so you need to fight for it. I also spend a lot of time in other parts of the country, including including places that my family is from, where people still are in that fight. I was in Egypt just a couple of days ago, where they're so desperate for democracy, right? It's not a country that's falling apart. It's relatively stable, but they don't have democracy. I travel a lot in the Arab world. They don't have democracy. Sadly, for a lot of my Israeli friends, they don't have democracy. They believe they do. They say they do. But what we've seen for the last 2 years, including in those protests in the street, is that they don't. Everybody wants fairness and justice and equality. And what I've realized is that I am part of that fight and you're part of that fight, as much as my great-grandfather was, and my great-grandmother, and my grandparents were, and my sister and my mother. That's what I'm writing about, that we're all in it together. And the point of the small acts of courage is that you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to solve America and the election of 2024, Israel and Gaza, Russia and Ukraine. You don't have to solve, just solve something. And sometimes that something is very close. And you personally have been involved in a lot of things where you've taken on a small matter here in New York, something that has been wrong. And it doesn't change the world, but it changes something. And guess what? You win. So you're empowered to do it again. And that's how you go from little things to big things. Small acts of courage are where success lies.
And Small Acts of Courage is the title of the book as well, by our friend Ali Velshi. Ali, thank you for joining us here at Salon. Congratulations on the book. It's a great read, very compelling. And I'm Dean Obeidallah, and thank you for watching Salon Talks.
Thank you for watching Salon Talks. If you had a good time, why not subscribe right over here so you can get more conversations with your favorite artists, actors, directors, writers, comedians, musicians, politicians, everybody you love, and I love too. And while you're here, why not watch another video right now?